guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merril Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. One of the messages Point of View makes often is it is critical that Christians become informed and exercise their right to vote. But who are we supposed to vote for? Kirby Anderson tracks important issues and candidates regularly and brings you that information here on Point of View. But the show can't cover everything. It can't cover all issues, can't cover all candidates. That's why it's important for churches and local organizations to do that and provide that information for people. But there's an organization that does that on a federal level, on a national level, and it's iVoterGuide. Joining us to talk about the organization and its efforts is Debbie Wuthnow. She's president of iVoterGuide and a member of its board of directors. She holds a master's degree in computer science from Princeton University and was an engineer at AT&T Bell Laboratories for several years. Wuthnow joined iVoterGuide in 2011 as a data analyst and became its president in 2018. Thank you so much for joining us, Debbie.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have to say, whenever I'm sitting down to a performance and I see somebody is going to do a handbell presentation, a smile comes to my face, and you're a handbell musician.
I am. COVID kind of interrupted that briefly, but for, 20 years I played handbells in a quartet and a couple of high-level choirs. So just I love ringing praises to the Lord. You know, it's just amazing how you just see people love that music coming from a handbell, and it just brings a joy to my heart. Well, iVoterGuide has been around for a while. For the 2020 election, you provided information for about 8,000 candidates, 3,500 races in the election, and just a lot of information. Give us a little background on iVoterGuide and what you're doing. Well, iVoterGuide began in Texas back in 2008 with the concept of it's more important to look at what a candidate has done than what they say they're going to do. And the research included who have they given money to, who have they received money from, if they've ever held office, how have they voted when push came to shove? What kind of votes have they cast for family and freedom? And then endorsements, candidate surveys, and then uniquely, iVoterGuide does an evaluation of each candidate and their political philosophy based on the data and then available online. Well, after 2010, there was a realization that Texas was doing okay, but the rest of the nation needed some help. So that's
still true.
Well, and it is, and we're growing. So the help has been needed. So at that point, iVoterGuide became nationwide, and we didn't go as far down the ballot, but we covered all the federal races in all 50 states, so all the senators and all the Congress. And then there's always been a dozen or so states where kind of key races were on the ballot, and iVoterGuide would extend that research to statewide and state legislative candidates. And in 2020, we expanded to where there were 21 states where we covered all the statewide candidates. And I'm talking railroad commissioner and ag commissioner. And, races, even though they're at the top of the statewide ballot, that it's really difficult to find information on those candidates. And we did. All of the data that we provided, campaign finance to surveys, is provided on all of those candidates and that evaluation. So we not only dug for the truth, but we evaluated those 8,000 candidates in 2020 and just were used by 3.5 million voters to give them the truth.
This is a monumental job. You've had to grow the organization in order to do that.
It has needed to grow, and by God's grace, it will continue to expand. As resources become available, our goal, our vision is to grow into more states. By 2022, we'd like to be in 35 states, down to the state rep level.
If I'm a voter, how do I find out about iVoterGuide? How do I get that information? Do you send it out on emails? How do I learn about you?
Well, there's a couple ways. The easiest is to go to iVoterGuide.com, and it's the letter I, so you can think of it as an internet voter guide or an individualized voter guide. But go to iVoterGuide.com, and you'll see up at the top, it'll have our saying, which is grounded in God, rooted in research, but there'll be a box for you to enter your voting address. So we personalize the data available to you to your specific voting address. And this happens nationwide. So I can send iVoterGuide the link to it to my sister in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, my brother in Pennsylvania, and they still get their personalized voter guide. And based on that address, we will show you just the races that are on your ballot, so that you have information about all the candidates that are on those races, and all the data is there to see. So you can kind of trust how we've evaluated the candidate, but you can verify. You can go read their Facebook, you can read their LinkedIn, you can read their Twitter. We gather it all into one place, like a one-stop shop for voting resources.
You know, it's important because voters tend to focus, I think, in many cases on the big issues and the big elections, and not so much on the local ones. Here, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I had in a couple of people who were running for mayor of a small town and for the city council of a small town. And the point of that being, this was right after the election, but the point of it being is that this is how you learn to get engaged and involved, but these people affect our lives in ways that, a lot of things that happen at the federal level don't necessarily affect me. A lot of things that happen at the school board and the local level affect me greatly.
I completely agree. And we've expanded our focus to some of those local races. In just this past May, we researched 20 school districts in Texas. It's kind of a pilot program to see what could happen. And we're really encouraged by the number of people who turned out to vote really increased because we provided some good factual information on those candidates. It's pretty hard to find sometimes. We had to dig pretty deep. But we've also done, we've written an ebook that can educate you on what to look for in your school board. iVoterGuide, it would take, a lot of funding, a lot of bandwidth for us to research all of the school boards, and God willing, that will eventually happen. But we have the ebook called Whose Side Are They On Anyway? If you sign up for our email list or contact us on our website, we'll send you that educational information, and it'll give you tools and train you in how to evaluate your candidates. Because it's really important to vote in every election, not just November every 2 years.
I agree with you completely. Our guest right now is Debbie Wuthnow. She is president of iVoterGuide, and this is an organization that provides information to people around the country, to voters and Christians, especially with a Christian focus, about candidates out there, issues, what you should know about those. This is something that smaller groups tend to do at times, but it is very difficult to do this on a national level, and they're jumping into this and making this information available to us because we need to be informed voters as we go out there. If the 2020 election demonstrated anything, it is that informed Christians need to be able to go out and vote their values, and they need to do so knowledgeably, not just at the top of the ticket, but also down the ballot, because we've got a number of areas that affect us from federal and state, but also local, county, and city elections, and the school board, one of the most important ones. We need to see more Christians engaged in the school board, not just in the elections, but actually jumping into the school board elections and becoming a candidate in those things so that they can bring their values there. Stay with us. We'll be back with Debbie Wuthnow in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The opening lines of a Wall Street Journal editorial observe, that didn't take long. We aren't even a half a year into the Biden presidency and already have an IRS scandal. ProPublica published the secret IRS files showing how some of the wealthiest Americans avoid income tax. It documents the years in which Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Michael Bloomberg paid no federal income taxes. It also provides an inside look at the financial lives of Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Mark Zuckerberg, and George Soros. What's the legal issue? Leaking such income information is a crime. Federal tax returns are confidential. Someone inside the IRS or associated with it leaked this information. The timing is not coincidental. Senator Ron Wyden opened his Financial Committee hearing a week ago, quoting from this IRS data dump. The Biden administration has proposed the largest tax increase as a share of the economy since 1968. An op-ed by Charles Cook said, "We can't trust the IRS. That is really the conclusion we should have. Each time this happens, there's an excuse. Last time it was the fact that Donald Trump declined to release his tax returns. That didn't justify breaking the law. This time it was the wealthy aren't paying their fair share. You may think that the people being exposed deserve it, but they deserve the same rights as other citizens. And if it is possible to obtain the tax records of influential people who have an army of lawyers, what chance do you have of keeping your financial records private?" Here's my biggest concern with the latest IRS scandal. Only a few media outlets even considered releasing confidential tax information to be a scandal. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. On the line with me is Debbie Wuthnow. She is president of iVoterGuide, and they cover a number of candidates around the country, thousands of them. But Debbie, you it's not just candidates. You cover some issues, and I have to say, a few years back, one of the most disappointing moments I've had is when I saw President Obama covered the White House in a rainbow colors because they were making a statement, and I just thought, why you don't have to do that. That's just leave those issues alone. But President Obama did that, and President Joe Biden sort of doubling down on this as we're in Gay Pride Month, and they're doing their best to try to show that, especially with the flag.
Yes, exactly. I was really shocked when I had somebody text me earlier this month that there was an elementary school that was flying the American on one pole, the American flag, the Texas flag, and the Gay Pride flag on the same pole. And I honestly had to top of the car, drive down and take a picture of it because I was just shocked that was being really promoted and pushed at the elementary level. And it's a consequence of, the White House turned rainbow because of who we elected as president, and we look at what happened in the school district, and that is from elections as well, from who we've elected to be on the school board. So anytime we see things that it's not exactly what we would have wanted to happen, I think we can usually draw a line to those people that we've elected to make those decisions.
Indeed. Now, there have been others. I think the Christian Coalition used to do a voter's guide. I think my recollection is they got in trouble for doing that. But you're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. What are you do not endorse specific candidates or legislation. I'm with a nonprofit also. I cannot endorse specific candidates or legislation. But it is important that people become informed about this. And are you seeing a rise in that, and especially with the 2020 election? And of course, we're looking forward to 2022 and 2024. What are you doing to prepare for that?
Well, we're doing quite a few things. We're doing a lot of research into the issues, and we're communicating that both through emails to people that are on our email list. I would encourage you, because we're sending education about, filibuster. What is it? How does it impact me? Why should I care? What's going on in our schools with comprehensive sex education, with the Project 1619, with critical race theory. What can I do about it? So we're sending, it's just once a week, an email that's educational about what's going on in those issues, because you need to understand the issues as you lead up to the point where you would cast your ballot. So we're really trying to have some of that educational content. So I would encourage you to go to iVoterGuide.com and scroll down to where it says join us and join our email list. And then those are the same issues that we will be using as we evaluate candidates. So we're trying to look for their positions on these types of issues, and getting at their worldview, so we can know if they share our values or not, and who's worthy of earning our vote.
In your experience, do you see Christians becoming more engaged and voting their values?
I see Christian turnout in the last election was really good. And one of the things that I'm going to point to is those school board elections that we covered in Texas, because local elections typically have even a lower turnout than the national elections. It could be, 6 or 8% is all that votes. And in of the districts that we covered, the ones that had, district-wide races, their turnout was at least 1.5 times normal to 5 times normal. And that, to me, says that voters are waking up and paying attention, and they're watching to make sure that all of their votes are count. We're getting some people who are discouraged about that. That's also something we're working towards, is election integrity and supporting those types of things that are trying to get at the root, make sure every legal vote counts, and that it's harder to cheat. But, I think people are waking up to some of these issues. It's impacting their daily lives, and they're starting to understand that I do have a voice. I live in a republic. I have a voice. I have a responsibility. And really, iVoterGuide's mission is to equip Christians to be good stewards of their authority to vote.
It's interesting. I'm old enough to recall when Jerry Falwell got involved in this and created the moral majority. And prior to that, Christians didn't seem to be. It was not something that they thought about voting. Some Catholics might have been because of the issue of abortion and so forth. But for the most part, Christians were not terribly engaged with regard to their values and their faith. They just voted. But Jerry Falwell sort of got this ball rolling, and it has really picked up, I think, in the past few years. The Christian Coalition had a major impact on that, but they are not the force they used to be. Are you becoming the force that we need out there, you think?
We're trying to do the part God's planned for us. So, whatever God's got planned, we're trying to unite Christian groups. We actually, our model of business is based on the body of Christ, that we really do the one thing that we feel God has called us to do, which is to find the truth about the candidates, every candidate that's on the ballot, God willing. And then we link arms with like-minded groups to try to get the word out about the truth and the availability that iVoterGuide is, where it is, and to give them a resource for that. So there are 60 different like-minded groups that partner with us, including American Family Association, including Point of View Radio, including Family Research Council, some state policy groups, even pastors groups, because there are, movements of pastors to equip their church not just on biblical truth, but on their civic responsibility, and to encourage them to run for office and to vote wisely. So I think Christian Coalition was the beginning, and we're trying to play our role now.
Do you rely on volunteers to provide information and help you in what you're doing?
It's a combination. We have a staff of several dozen paid researchers that really view it as a ministry, because we're a nonprofit. And then we had over 650 volunteers who helped us to rate those candidates. So that panel evaluation is actually done by volunteers, and we're going to need to hopefully double that this year. So if you are interested,
that's where I was going next.
How do volunteer? Okay.
How do they get in touch with you?
They go to iVoterGuide.com, and at the top menu, you'll see the word ACT. If you click on ACT on that page, it's all the different ways that you could engage with us. One of those is to volunteer as a panelist. So, go there, fill out that application, because we want our panelists to be like-minded with us. You do have to apply. We do vet you. We're going to call your references, but then we're going to train you in how to go through and evaluate candidates. And not only then do you help evaluate the candidates that iVoterGuide is covering, those 8,000 candidates, and hopefully double. But it's going to teach you how to evaluate candidates that iVoterGuide doesn't cover, what to look for, what to dig for. So it helps you be a more informed and engaged voter.
It takes help to cover that many candidates that are around the country, so I'm glad you're doing that. So take just about a minute to tell us, if I'm discouraged, if I'm a voter and I just feel like my vote doesn't count, how do you encourage us?
I would encourage you that God comes first. And God gives us each time, talents, and treasures. And he in the parable of the talents, wants us to be good stewards of those things. As a Christian, it is our responsibility, because we live in this republic, to participate in that republic. It's like letting your light shine. Don't hide it under a bushel. Make your voice heard. You don't have to stand on the corner and preach, but at your very least, make your voice heard when it's time to vote, and in every election down to the local elections. And for those who are discouraged about what potentially could have happened in this last election, there are many things that are working in the background. There are state legislators that are working on tightening up election integrity. There are audits going on to try to clean up things. There are groups trying to get the voter rolls cleaned up. But all in all, we each individually do our part and trust that God, who is sovereign, has control of the big picture. So your responsibility is to vote, and to vote in an informed manner.
So I would encourage our listeners, if you're sitting around wondering, what can I do to play a role? I'm a housewife, or I have a job over here, but I want to be engaged and active. I'd encourage you to go to iVoterGuide.com and look at the information there. Consider being a volunteer. Fill out that information and see how that goes. We need those volunteers out there. Debbie, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you get a big response from this.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and just love your ministry. So thank you.
Thank you. And when we come back, we're going to turn to Dr. George Barna. He has been doing some recent research about what's going on in the among people of faith out there, and what's happening as they change their positions on things, and how the millennials are changing and what that means for us. So Point of View is going to be back with Dr. George Barna in a minute. Look at some of his recent research. He's a longtime friend of Point of View, and his released a new study. I think you're going to find this new study interesting about how the faith roles are changing. Stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View in just a minute.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merril Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And joining us by phone, Dr. George Barna, a longtime friend of Point of View. He's a professor at Arizona Christian University and the president of the Cultural Research Center at the university. He also founded the Barna Group and a research company that for years set the standard for understanding the trends in American culture. He's authored more than 50 books, some of which were New York Times bestsellers, and he's here to talk about their recent survey that they have released on the American Worldview Inventory 2021. Dr. Barna, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, buddy, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
You know, we were just talking with Debbie Wuthnow, president of iVoterGuide, about the role they provide information on candidates and issues for Christians out there so that they can go and vote their values. But your recent survey finds that the role of religion, especially among Christians, has been declining in the country and especially among millennials. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, sure. I mean, as we look at people's worldview, which is really the center point of understanding a person's faith, because it's the decision-making filter that every one of us relies upon every single day. What we're finding is that fewer and fewer Christians have that decision-making filter that corresponds with biblical truths and principles. Mm-hmm. Only 6% of adults in America have that biblical worldview, but excuse me, when you look at millennials in particular, we see those numbers declining even more radically, just 4% within that generation. But when you look at the second half of that percent, the number is cut in half again. So it's just 2% of those who are 25 or under the age of 25 who have a biblical worldview. So you look at the long-term implications of that for Christianity and the Christian church, and they're not very encouraging. What it says to us is, even though we still have close to 2 out of 3 people in America who call themselves Christians, and you still have a majority of millennials who consider themselves to be Christians, 57% of them, that doesn't mean the same thing that it used to. When you heard somebody say, yes, I'm a Christian, that meant that they believed in the Bible, they believed in Jesus, they believed that God existed, and that they wanted to live their way in a life that honored that God. That's no longer the case in America.
That trend has been going on for a little while, but it seems to me to have been accelerating over the past few years, maybe the past decade or so. Is that your finding?
Yes, definitely so. For some reason, and I think there are a number of different reasons, the last decade has brought about very dramatic changes in what people believe, how they practice their beliefs, how they think of themselves spiritually and personally, and the kind of life that they want Americans at large to be leading. Their perspective, their vision for the nation has radically changed over the last decade. So yeah, we really have to be awake right now. This is one of those times in history where I think we can't simply fall back on what we used to know about the nation. Things are changing very rapidly, unusually rapidly, brought about, I think, by technology and media and some other things. And so we've really got to be attentive, and we've got to be responsive.
One of the things you highlight is the change in Hispanics. Now, Hispanics are not a race, it's a language, and so you've got a lot of different races that speak Spanish or are sort of considered Hispanic background. But they've long been attracted and held to the Catholic faith. Some of that is changing, and even on the show here, I've had, I think, 2 or 3 times now, some local Hispanic activists who are engaged in politics. They're becoming more conservative. Many of them are becoming more evangelical. And we even saw in this last election some changes as that shocked some people, as the Hispanic vote tended to vote more conservatively and more Republican than we've seen in the past. What are you seeing changing in the Hispanic community?
Well, their faith inclinations are changing quite dramatically. Again, if we go back to just 30 years ago, 1991, 6 out of 10 Hispanics associated with the Catholic Church. If we look at where that stands today, it's less than half that number, just 28%. And a lot of people would say, well, yeah, because they're moving over to the Protestant churches, they're becoming evangelicals. We don't actually see that happening in the data. The proportion of Protestants in the Hispanic community has remained just about the same. Where the big shift has come is in this group that we call the don'ts. And these are people who don't know if God exists, don't care if God exists, or don't believe that he exists. And whereas back in 1991, 3% of Hispanics fit in that don'ts category, that's multiplied tenfold to the point where today 31% of all Hispanics are in the don'ts category. And what that means is, therefore, you've got 3 basically equally sized groups among the Hispanic population in America: Catholics, Protestants, and don'ts. And where you see the movement happening, of course, is it's away from the Catholic Church and toward that don'ts category.
One of the things you highlight is that while the Christian faith, whether you're talking about Catholic, Protestant, and evangelical and so forth, has been declining some other religions, though not large, are actually picking up steam. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, one of those, which frankly kind of surprised me, is the recent and rapid growth in the Muslim faith in America, the Islamic Church. What we found there is, if you go back to 1991, when we were studying it in the early 90s and prior, the Islamic faith didn't even show up on the radar. It was, statistically an asterisk, which usually means less than 0.5%. And if I recall right, back in 91, it was about 0.2% of the American population that identified with the Muslim faith. That stayed pretty similar up until recently, where, again, around 2010, 2011, things started to shift dramatically. And what we have now is 3% of the population who are Muslim. Now, some people say, 3%, why are you getting all excited about that? That's still very little. It is. But what makes it significant is, number one, the rate of growth. The fact that you've had that much growth in that particular faith in the last decade is a big deal. Secondly, when you put it in context, here's something that a lot of people don't realize. The Jewish faith in America, Judaism, is about 1.5% of the American population. That means that right now we've got, for the first time in America's history, roughly twice as many Muslims in America as we have Jews in America. That's a very significant shift.
That point that you just made was where I was going to go next, which is the Jewish people of Jewish background and faith are just have a major impact on the country, and I appreciate that impact. But it's a much smaller percentage than what you would think, given their impact in the country, and that could be the case for the Muslim faith also, I guess you're saying.
Absolutely, especially since we know that the Jewish faith is not growing in America, and yet when you look at the rapid growth of Islam in America, we expect it to have more impact. And of course, they, like Jews in America, believe that it's important to impact the culture. They want to leave a mark on this culture. They want to help direct the flow of the culture. Muslims want to do the same thing in America. That's one of the reasons why many of them apparently come to America. And so, yes, we expect to see more influence from that particular group.
My guest for this segment is Dr. George Barna. He is at Arizona Christian University, and he's just released his most recent study on the worldview in the U.S. and the changes that are happening. That's the American Worldview Inventory 2021. He has long tracked what's happened in the country and the changing religious views and other things. And a lot of us have relied on that information for just trying to understand what's happening in the country. And of course, this time he's highlighting the changes in the Hispanic faith, and especially among millennials, and the growth of new faiths that are small now, but they are growing both in the Muslim community and in other Asian, Eastern, and New Age religions. So, Dr. Barna, when we come back from the break, I want to ask the question: is that change that's happening there among Muslims, is that just a growth of more Muslims moving to the country, or is that people who are traditionally of no faith, or Americans or Christians, who are converting to Islam, and the impact that might have? So stay with us. You can find out more about Dr. Barna or his study at pointofview.net. We also have information about his organization there and a way to reach out to him. So I would encourage you to do that. And we're going to be back in just a minute to continue our discussion with Dr. George Barna. Stay with us.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our final segment with Dr. George Barna, longtime tracker of the changing American culture. And, of course, he is at Arizona Christian University now and still engaged in that work. So, Dr. Barna, are the changes we're seeing in the rise in the Muslim community, and also the Muslim faith, Islamic faith, and in Asian religions, is that people who were something else and are now converting, or is that just immigration and more people moving who are holding that belief?
Well, I believe it's actually two different avenues. When we look at the Eastern religions that are growing, what we're finding is that a lot of that does have to do with conversion. And that's related to some of the lifestyle elements that people feel comfortable with the Asian religions, whether it's yoga or meditation or ideas like karma and reincarnation. All of that contributes to the appeal of those faiths. When we look at Islam, it's a bit of a different story. That's more so coming from immigration than it is conversion. And that's partly because it actually is pretty difficult to convert people to a different religion these days. The fact that, people are suspicious of religious claims. They tend to believe that all faiths are of equal value. Most Americans would say it's more important that you have faith than that you have any particular faith. So making the case for the Islamic faith is difficult, particularly with those who are most likely to convert, which would be young people. Young people look at Islam and they see it as a pretty demanding and strict faith that has a number of absolutes, and that doesn't appeal to younger people. That would appeal more to older people, and yet it's the older people who already pretty much have their faith choices in place. So that's probably not who they're going to be converting.
In this decline of people who are holding traditional Christian views, I wonder if part of this is just not a winnowing out of people who just automatically said I was Christian. I would have, if asked on documents when I was younger, I had to put down either Christian or Protestant long before I actually became a Christian. So I'm wondering if some of that is just not those who just sort of claim to be Christian but really are not Christian, never attend a church and so forth, are sort of drifting off, and so we know who really is a Christian more by the numbers? Or is that really a decline in people who were active and engaged in Christianity, would have been a professing evangelical or something else, and then now dropping out?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that there is a winnowing out, as you put it, of what we have considered to be Christians. I'd done some research and read the book Seven Faith Tribes a number of years ago that looked at that very issue. And what we discovered is that the vast majority of people who called themselves Christians, I think it was about 6 out of every 7 who called themselves Christians, were what we wound up identifying as casual Christians, or some people might call them cultural Christians. They embrace the name. They don't really embrace the faith. You're really only looking at maybe 1 out of every 10 who call themselves Christians who actually are deeply committed to that faith. So I think we're now in a period of culture where, given the attitudes and the expectations and the desires of millennials in particular, there's less of a tendency to align oneself with a faith that they really don't embrace, that they really don't understand, or that they really don't want to be part of in a full orbed manner. And so there is that change taking place in our culture as well.
You highlight what you call the 4 critical spiritual indicators and how those are changing. Identify those 4 spiritual indicators and what you see changing there.
Yeah, over the last 40 years that I've been doing this, of course, you look for things that will give you a heads up that things are really changing significantly. And among those are these 4 that I point out in the current report, one of them being the belief in the existence of God, defined as the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe who still rules the world today. Back in 1991, 86%, almost 9 out of 10 Americans, believed in that kind of God. Today, it's less than half. It's down to 46%. A second factor we looked at has to do with the Bible. And it used to be that 7 out of 10 Americans back in 1991 believed that the Bible is the accurate and reliable Word of God. That's dropped to just 41% today. You look at a third thing, people that we would consider to be born again, not because they call themselves that, but because they say that after they die, they know that they will go to heaven, but only because they've confessed their sins and accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. Now, that hit a high point around 2006 or so, when we had 45% of adults in this country saying that that characterized their beliefs, and yet that has now dropped to 30% in our country. And then the final one, of course, has to do with worldview. How many people have a biblical worldview? We measure that by looking at 51 different factors of belief and behavior. But when we look at that, we track that, we find that that's dropped by 50%. It's dropped from 12% down to 6% in the last 25 years. So you put all of those things together, and that quartet of factors gives us a pretty good sense of the fact that while somewhat fewer people are describing themselves as Christian, it used to be 9 out of 10, now we're down to about 2 out of 3. The bigger issue is, what do they mean by that? What does that mean to them? And we're finding that a huge swath of the population has really lost touch with the core elements of Christianity.
Mm-hmm. We're getting close to the end of our segment here, but so many parents, so many teenagers are wishing there was a good Christian university they could attend to. So many universities that had been strongly Christian have sort of moderated or declined in their views over years. Tell us about Arizona Christian University.
Well, the whole purpose of the university is to really focus on worldview. So every class that's taught, every major that a student takes, every sport that they play, everything that we do on that campus is done through the lens of a biblical worldview. Why? Because our goal is to graduate individuals who not only have a biblical worldview, but realize that the purpose of having it isn't academic, it's for cultural transformation. We're out in the world trying to change the world for the glory of God by bringing that worldview to bear in any particular industry or occupation. And so every student that graduates, we want them to be prepared to be a world changer, taking that worldview and converting it into a lifestyle and into choices that they make on the job that will really impact the world in a positive way for the kingdom of God.
We have a link to your new study on pointofview.net, so listeners can go there. Tell us how they reach out to you or the university, or find out more about your organization there.
Yeah, I mean, they can get the research by going to culturalresearchcenter.com. And if they're interested in more information about the university, arizonachristian.edu will get them onto the college's website, and they can look at all the courses, the faculty, the extracurricular activities, the statement of faith. We're a covenantal college. So when you come there, you're buying into a covenant with the faculty, the staff, and the other students about how we're going to live and what we're trying to achieve. And we'd love more people to be involved in that.
Dr. Barna, thank you so much for your years of service and your profession of faith. You've been a real just benefit to the country. Such a treasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Memphis. It's been great to be with you. I appreciate it.
When we come back, we're going to change and talk to Joel C. Rosenberg. He's written many novels, but he also lives in Jerusalem, and he's going to talk about some of the problems we are facing in the Middle East. Stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View in just a minute.
You can make a difference. Yes, we face big tech censorship, government overreach, biblical illiteracy, and many other ills. And while there's no single action to overcome them, no real-life Captain America to come to our rescue, it's a fact that everyday Americans, like you, are the key to turning things around. The biggest thing you have is that you care, and all you need is the encouragement and the will to stand up for what's right. Your gift of Point of View enables us to reach more people with the information and free resources they need to join you in making a real difference in our homes, at work, in our churches, and our communities. Some of our friends have put $55,000 on the table as a matching challenge. You give, they will match it. Make a difference today by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Double your impact today. Make a difference by taking this first step. pointofview.net/difference and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. I'm Merril Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And we have scheduled to speak with Joel C. Rosenberg here in just a few minutes. I think they're still trying to get him on the line. He's just recently, he's coming out with a book, Enemies and Allies, which I'm holding up here for the camera to see. It's interesting because Joel has been involved in writing a number of novels that have become very, very popular, mostly about the Middle East. I've read some of them. I've read some of his nonfiction works as well. But Enemies and Allies, I think, is slated to come out in September. So this is just a preview copy that I have here. But he goes through, he has interviewed over the past several years, he's interviewed a number of major political figures, including Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, Benjamin Netanyahu, who he had a relationship with, actually worked with just a little bit for a while. But he's also sat down with a number of major Middle Eastern leaders and interviewed them, and he's pulling together in the book his thoughts about what's happening in the Middle East and some of the changes that are going on. And he sees a number of changes happening there, and we're seeing them ourselves. One of the major changes that occurred was, of course, the Abraham Accords, which President Donald Trump and Jared Kushner were able to push through. And that was, I think, one of the most, I'm going to say, effective changes that has occurred. It's not entirely clear if the Biden administration is going to continue with those changes. Initially, they said they would. I'm not sure they're going to continue with them, but it has. It was for the first time opening up areas in the Middle East for people, for countries to be able to work with Israel, and these were countries that had long been enemies of Israel. Every U.S. president comes in with the goal of trying to address the issue of the Middle East and seeing if they can't bring some kind of peace to the Middle East. They usually almost always sort of lean towards the Palestinians and give deference to the Palestinians. And I've long thought that that's just not going to work. You're going to have to drop that and move forward with Israel and the other countries. The Abraham Accords did that. You know, in thinking about that, back several years ago when Barack Obama was president, and he decided to reach out to Cuba, President Fidel Castro, and enter an agreement with them to try to begin to sort of normalize relations that we have not had with Cuba for decades. And I said at the time, I don't know that Barack Obama was the right person to do it, but what he said was, what we've been doing for the past 50 years isn't working. We're going to try something new. And I thought that's actually, I think, the right approach. It wasn't working with Cuba. It was time to try something new. I don't think he necessarily did it right, but it was the sentiment. And I thought that I've been thinking the same thing about Palestinians for some time. What we've been trying to do since 1948 hasn't worked. And so we need to try to find something that would work. And so I was pleased that Donald Trump actually jumped into this with the Abraham Accords. He set the Palestinians aside and started a new approach that I think actually worked fairly well. He was able to get the United Arab Emirates to sign on, eventually Saudi Arabia. We've had a relationship with Egypt for some time. It's been a fairly good relationship, but not not a close relationship, and we've had a relationship. I say we. Israel's had a relationship with Jordan, but not a close one again. But the Abraham Accords were able to start that process going in a way that we have not been able to see in the past, and where they've started exchanging diplomats, they've started exchanging students. People have been able to fly back and forth between those countries, and I think the Abraham Accords were a major step forward in peace in the Middle East, both for Israel and for many of the other countries. But you had to do it by saying we're not going to continue to let the Palestinians have a veto on what we're doing in the Middle East. We're going to move forward with other countries that are willing to step forward and begin to have a relationship with Israel and just let that relationship grow. And Donald Trump was able to achieve it. My concern is that that Joe Biden and his people being more favorable to the Palestinians will begin to pull that back some and drop off from that. And I think that would just be tragic. But in the book, Joel goes through a number of the changes that he's seeing as he discusses things with some of the various Middle East leaders, like the head of Saudi Arabia now, Mohammed bin Salman. He just goes by MBS. That's the usual term they use for him, and he has become a major voice in trying to make some changes there. They are minor. I know that I've listened to people who are in Saudi Arabia, especially women, who feel like this is just window dressing and maybe not major changes coming yet, but he is beginning to relax some of the things, allow more women to work, women to drive, women to be able to do things that has not been the case in Saudi Arabia for forever. And so it's I would think, a major step forward. So I hope we'll be able to get Joel on the phone here in just a minute, and he'll tell us about some of the things that he is finding there. Now, some of these interviews that he's done with Mike Pompeo, he started that, I think, around 2015, so it was a little while back, and he's been able to talk with him several times since then. He also spent, during his college years, Joel is actually, his father moved here. His father is of Jewish descent, moved to America in New York several years ago, and so Joel has a Jewish background on his father's side. He spent a year at Tel Aviv University during his years in college, so he spent some time there studying and became a fluent Hebrew speaker and became engaged in that process. And so after college, he went to work in Washington and was there for several years, working for various organizations, both nonprofit organizations and for some political leaders, and just trying to expand his efforts there. So at some point, he began to start writing novels. And when I first heard, because I had known Joel in the early days, back in the 90s, when I heard he had written a book, a novel, I thought, Joel wrote a book? I had no idea. And it turns out it ended up being a bestseller, and the rest is history. But he ended up moving to Israel. He ended up getting both joint U.S. and Israeli citizenship, and he still lives in Israel these days and comes back to the U.S. frequently. I think he's here in Dallas at the National Religious Broadcasters meeting, which is going on in Dallas and has a lot of people flooding in there. So when we come back from the break, I hope we'll be able to get him in so he can come and talk to us a bit about his book. So that name of that book, Enemies and Allies. And what he's talking about here is the changes that are moving in the Middle East. The subtitle of the book, an unforgettable journey inside the fast-moving and immensely turbulent modern Middle East. He sees prospects for things changing in the Middle East coming, and I'm hoping he's right. So stay with us. We're going to be back in just a minute. I hope we'll have Joel on the line by then, and we'll begin to get some questions about his book. Stay with us. We'll be back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The opening lines of a Wall Street Journal editorial observe, that didn't take long. We aren't even a half a year into the Biden presidency and already have an IRS scandal. ProPublica published the secret IRS files showing how some of the wealthiest Americans avoid income tax. It documents the years in which Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Michael Bloomberg paid no federal income taxes. It also provides an inside look at the financial lives of Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Mark Zuckerberg, and George Soros. What's the legal issue? Leaking such income information is a crime. Federal tax returns are confidential. Someone inside the IRS or associated with it leaked this information. The timing is not coincidental. Senator Ron Wyden opened his Financial Committee hearing a week ago, quoting from this IRS data dump. The Biden administration has proposed the largest tax increase as a share of the economy since 1968. An op-ed by Charles Cook said, "We can't trust the IRS. That is really the conclusion we should have. Each time this happens, there's an excuse. Last time it was the fact that Donald Trump declined to release his tax returns. That didn't justify breaking the law. This time it was the wealthy aren't paying their fair share." You may think that the people being exposed deserve it, but they deserve the same rights as other citizens. And if it is possible to obtain the tax records of influential people who have an army of lawyers, what chance do you have of keeping your financial records private? Here's my biggest concern with the latest IRS scandal. Only a few media outlets even considered releasing confidential tax information to be a scandal. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. Merril Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and I believe we have Joel on the line. Joe, are you with us?
I am. How are you, Merril?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Listen, we're so pleased to have you. In that first segment, I gave a little bit about your background. I talked about your upcoming book, which we want to talk about in a minute. I don't know that you will recall this, but back in the 1990s, you and I used to cross paths every now and then, usually when I was in Washington and attending the Wednesday meeting at Americans for Tax Reform. We'd say hello to each other for just a minute or two, and then sometime shortly thereafter, you had gone to work to, I think, as political advisor to Steve Forbes for his presidential campaign.
That's right. I do remember that. And I can't remember the first time we met, whether I might have been working as research director for Rush Limbaugh at that point or whether I was already with Steve Forbes. But, yes, I absolutely remember. And it's nice to be here deep in the heart of Texas. And, at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention.
I mentioned you were here, and then actually Steve Forbes used to call occasionally when he was a presidential candidate, and then sometimes afterwards for his columns, trying to make sure on certain policy issues that he had this little specific fact or something right. So I never worked for Steve, but I did write for Forbes.com for a while. He asked me to do that. But at any rate, I saw you went on and you wrote a novel, and I thought, Joel wrote a novel? Really? And it turned out to be a bestseller. And
all my liberal friends thought I was writing fiction when I wrote for Rush Limbaugh, but
So let's start out with your book. Now, I mentioned to the audience that the book is not out yet. I think it says it's coming out in September, so I've got a pre-release copy. But Enemies and Allies, and you go through and you've interviewed a number of major figures in the Middle East, and of course some U.S. people, Mike Pompeo and others who have played a role in that. So let's start out. What gave you you were doing these interviews over several years, so I don't know if you had in mind the book then, or if at some point you said, I've gotten so much information from these people and I need to put this down because the Middle East is becoming, it's always been a problem for us, and it is in many ways becoming even a more problem. But with the Abraham Accords, I thought we might be seeing a change coming, but you want to highlight some of the changes that are happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, it has been an interesting story, Merril. I did not intend to write a nonfiction book about any of this. I had pretty much, the last nonfiction book I wrote was 8 years ago, and mostly I've been writing political thrillers, and again, mostly about worst-case scenarios in the Middle East. But unexpectedly, very unexpectedly, the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, ended up reading one of my novels. And the book happened to be about terrorists trying to kill him. Okay, he was a character in the novel. He didn't know it, but one of his advisors had picked it up in Heathrow Airport in London, and he didn't know who I was or never read any of my novels, but just thought this one looked interesting, picked it up, started reading it on a plane. The next thing he knows, ISIS terrorists have blown up the king's palace in Amman, and ISIS is overrunning the country, and the king is trying to order a counter-strike, a counter-offensive, and the advisor reads this book, and he brings it to the king, and he says, "Your Majesty, you have to read this." And the king says, "Why?" He says, "Because you're in it." He says, "What do you mean?" He's looking at it, and he's like, "It's a novel, right? It's a political thriller." He goes, "Yes, but you're a character in the novel." So as it happens, King Abdullah read that thriller. It was called The First Hostage. And rather than banning me, Merril, from the Kingdom of Jordan forever, which he might well have done, rather he invited my wife and me to come for 5 days to get to know him. And this set into motion a friendship. And on the last evening, he invited us to his private palace for a private 2.5-hour dinner with some of his close personal friends. And at the end of the dinner, I said, "We have learned so much, and I want to say thank you. It's very rare for an American to get to sit with a moderate monarch in the Middle East. It's even rarer still for an evangelical to get to do it, and even rarer still for a Jewish evangelical American with Israeli citizenship and 2 boys in the Israeli army. That's impossible." So I said, "Would you ever consider inviting other evangelical leaders over to they're still going to love Israel. I'm not trying to change that, but I think it's important to understand the perspective of an Arab Muslim monarch who's fighting against ISIS and who is against radicalism and extremism." And he loved that idea. He said, "Joel, why don't we work together to put together a delegation of evangelical Christian leaders?" Well, this set into motion what became 6 delegations that I led to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia twice, to the United Arab Emirates, obviously to Jordan, to Israel. We led. I've done other trips into Bahrain, and each of those meetings with not just a nice, interesting person, but the kings and the crown princes and the presidents and the prime ministers. We spent hours and hours and hours with these folks, and it wasn't just that they wanted to answer our questions. They want the changes they're making in their countries to be known by Americans and by others. And so eventually we were getting so much news coverage for these trips that reporters started saying they wanted to write a book about this. And I thought, sure, I'm happy to help. But then I did say to my publisher, maybe I should write a book on this and tell it right and tell it first. And so this is the first book of its kind where, you have both a threat of Iran growing worse and worse, and you have these Abraham Accords and this Arab-Israeli peace dynamic, which is so historic, so interesting, so game-changing. But these are two forces that don't go together in many ways. And this is the first book that tells the story. And I take you inside the Oval Office. I take you inside the palaces of the Middle East and the Prime Minister's office in Israel. And you hear in their own words what these leaders, controversial but consequential, what do they believe and what do they want and how do they see the region 20 years after the 9/11 attacks? A lot has changed.
Many of your interviews took place during the Donald Trump era. He is not president anymore. What's your sense of Joe Biden? I think initially they said they were just going to sort of leave these in place, the Abraham Accords, but since then I think I've heard something that they're going to be pulling back on that. What's your sense of Joe Biden and the progress that was being made?
Well, it's a complicated question. I think that. Look, the first thing that is important to know is that President Biden's approach towards Iran is dangerous. It's disastrous. President Biden is trying to take the United States policy-wise back to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, that was not only so dangerous, but I thought was insane because it didn't end Iran's pathway to nuclear weapons. It paved the road to get there. It just delayed it a little bit. So I thought that plan was bad under Obama and Biden, and now Biden's trying to get back to it. So that's bad. Now, that being said, the only nice thing that Joe Biden said in the 2020 campaign about Donald Trump, the only thing was he did congratulate him and laud the Abraham Accords. These were not just 1, 2, or 3. These were 4 historic Arab-Israeli peace treaties with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, and a 5th agreement that wasn't Arab-Israeli but was Muslim-Israeli, that was with Kosovo. So you realize how historic those agreements are if Biden said something nice about them. I have talked to senior officials inside the Biden team, and I think they are going to build upon the Abraham Accords. I don't think they're going to back away, but I think they've had a few other things on their minds first. And so my view, both in the book, Enemies and Allies, but also in our website that we started last September, All Israel News, which is at allisrael.com. We're not partisan, and we're not going to take sides, but we are going to cover. If Biden does something right, we'll say it, and we'll report it. And if he does, he's doing a lot of things wrong, a lot of things we deeply disagree with, especially in the Middle East, and we are covering that.
Okay, hold that thought for a second. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about Benjamin Netanyahu, because you sat down with him as well. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merril Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and on the phone with me today is Joel C. Rosenberg, author of an upcoming book, Enemies and Allies, that looks at the Middle East and some of the changes that are going on there. So, Joel, when we left, I mentioned Benjamin Netanyahu. You've had a long relationship with him, at least off and on. He is out as prime minister. Naftali Bennett is in. You've had discussions with Netanyahu. What are his concerns about the Middle East?
Well, it's interesting. Netanyahu's departure from being prime minister is a huge shock to Israelis. Although obviously many Israelis were against him, but many Israelis love him and are deeply grateful for the accomplishments that he's made. I mean, if you think about it, I think American evangelicals are shocked too. I think the news is still spreading. Is Netanyahu really gone? Because he's been the longest serving prime minister in the modern history of Israel. You'd have to go back to the kings of Israel in the Bible times for an Israeli leader to have served this long. And now suddenly, a week and a half ago, boom, he's gone. And so understanding what he has accomplished is important. I think he's the most significant and consequential prime minister since the founding prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, back in 1948. And if you just look at the last few years, Netanyahu persuaded Trump to recognize Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the state of Israel. Netanyahu persuaded Trump to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Presidents have been promising that for 30 years, and they didn't do it.
It was a huge deal.
Netanyahu persuaded Trump to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Netanyahu persuaded Trump to withdraw from the flawed and dangerous and insane Iran nuclear deal and to apply the maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime. And then, if that weren't enough, then the four brokered Arab-Israeli peace treaties known as the Abraham Accords. That's just for starters. It doesn't even get into his economic accomplishments and others. Netanyahu should have been winning in a landslide, but he had 4 elections here in Israel in the last 2 years, and he could not cobble together a coalition, and now he's gone. And so I think a lot of people are scratching their heads. How could you be that successful and get removed? It had a lot more to do with inside baseball, honestly, in Israel. Netanyahu ticked off too many of his own team, his own philosophical and political compadres just couldn't take him anymore. They felt he'd broken too many promises, stabbed them in the back too many times, and they removed him. So Naftali Bennett is a name that almost no American knows, almost no world leader knows. So, but Naftali Bennett is the hand-chosen protege, disciple almost, of Benjamin Netanyahu. So you're not seeing a big philosophical change, a big political change, a big worldview change. Naftali Bennett sees the world exactly the way Netanyahu does. It's not like moving from Trump to Biden. It's like moving from Trump to Pence. You've got a style difference. You've got a personal animosity, that flared up in recent times, as did between Trump and Pence, clearly. But you really don't have a philosophical change. What you have mostly now, Merril, is the fact that Netanyahu was a global leader. I mean, over time, he had fashioned himself to be a world leader. Not even though we're a small country, 10 million people. But so even with Netanyahu's strengths and his weaknesses, removing him from the picture means you've gone from somebody that every world leader knows and will take his call to someone they've never heard of before. And that's going to have an effect. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's going to have an effect on how Israel conducts itself, in the world and vis-a-vis Washington with the Biden administration, for whom the Biden team is doing a lot of things dangerously wrong, but some things they're doing right. They're pushing back at the lunatics in their own party, the anti-Semites and the anti-Israel faction inside the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, the Squad, Elizabeth Warren. Biden is pushing back at that, so he gets credit for that. But it's going to be very challenging for this new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, to navigate.
You had mentioned earlier, I believe it's allisrael.com, and that's your website that covers
which is
news.
All Israel News, and the website is allisrael.com. And we are tracking in real time all the stories. We're doing original reporting, exclusive interviews, as well as linking to the good, incredible stories in English in the Israeli press, in the Arab press, and in the regional press. So it's sort of a one-stop shopping now if you're interested in what's happening in Israel and the region. Allisrael.com.
I have gone there and signed up for it myself, and so I was pleased to see that. I typically get every day, I think it's pronounced Arutz 7 or Arutz Shabbat, which is another daily email that comes out that sort of highlights some of the things, but yours is your email, and the website just looks very good. And you're also doing one on Arabia too, isn't it? Allarabia.com?
All Arab.news, and it's all Arab news. And these are basically 2 pages, 2 sections of the daily paper, as it were. There are 2 sites, All Israel News and All Arab News, but they're run by the same team, and they're cross-linked. The reason we started All Arab News at the same time, last September 1st, is because I had so many sources in the Arab world, Muslims, but also Christians, who were just not ready, honestly, to be interviewed, profiled, quoted by All Israel News. It was just a leap too far for some of them.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got some wonderful Arab Christians and Arab Muslims on our advisory board. So we're running the 2 sites simultaneously. And as you say, people can sign up for a free email alert so that it just brings the headlines to you. We usually send it out 3 times a week unless there's a rocket war or some major moment, and then sometimes we'll do it every day. But usually it's 3 times a week, and it's free, and it really will help people know what's happening, why it matters, and how to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and for the church in the Middle East.
One of the things you mentioned is you frequently ask the leaders that you were visiting with if you could pray with them.
Yeah, and it is pretty amazing to sit with, whether they're Muslim leaders or Jewish leaders, to have a Jewish follower of Jesus ask if I can pray for you in the name of Jesus, and then say yes. It's pretty exciting. We've had, and this book, Enemies and Allies, which comes out September 7th, as you mentioned, we don't just deal with war and terror and peace and prosperity. We also deal with the issues of religious freedom. We sit with the most powerful leaders in Saudi Arabia, and we say to them, why aren't you allowing a single church to be open in your country?
Mm-hmm.
Next door in the United Arab Emirates, there's 700 freely operating churches. We said there's 1.4 million Christians in Saudi Arabia. They're foreign workers. They're not Saudi nationals, but they live here and they don't have a church to go to. Anyway, those answers are in the book.
In our closing minutes here, take about 1 minute to talk about whether or not you are optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the Middle East.
Well, you got to give me a time frame, right? So I'm optimistic that Jesus is coming and is going to make it all right. Before that, it gets worse. But before that, it could get better for a while, right? We're talking about birth pangs. So things are going to get bad. That's a contraction. But then they'll get a little bit better. That's a release. And then they'll get worse, and then they'll get better. But ultimately, yes, Jesus is going to fix it. But between now and then, things get very, very dangerous. And that's why I've written Enemies and Allies. That's why I'm doing All Israel News and All Arab News. Because in Las Vegas, the old line, right? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and it's not true of the Middle East. You can try to look away, but what happens in the Middle East is going to force you to look, because some of these things are prophetic trend lines, and the church may want to ignore it, but God will not allow us to. And what I'm trying to do is help educate people from a biblical worldview. What's happening? What does it mean? And why does it matter?
Joel, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Mayor. Great to be with you and great to be deep in the heart of Texas.
Indeed, indeed. The book is Enemies and Allies by Joel C. Rosenberg. It is not released yet. It doesn't come out until September 7th. It'll be published by Tyndale, so that is a major Christian press, and I would encourage you to go take a look at it. Also sign up for All Israel News and All Arab News, and I think you will find those things very interesting. You also go to pointofview.net and get some information about Joel there, and a way to reach out to him on his Twitter handle. So stay with us. We'll be back for our closing segment.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to our final segment on Point of View today. Enjoyed having Joel Rosenberg talking about his new book, which I'm holding up here, Enemies and Allies. That is going to be out on September 7. And it's amazing. Joel has frequently, he was talking about a book that came out about terrorism, a novel, and that implicated King Abdullah of Jordan. He frequently writes books that emerge right before something happens. That may be the Lord's providence, it may be just his insight, but my goodness, he often does that, and then it gets people's attentions. And of course, in his new book, he highlights some of the issues that are happening in the Middle East. And he starts out by saying what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. He mentions that, but that never happens in the Middle East. What happens in the Middle East goes on and affects the rest of the world. And he highlights some of the issues that the Middle East is facing right now. And so you've got Afghanistan. We are pulling our troops out of Afghanistan right now. That is going to leave Afghanistan open for the expansion of the Taliban. He discusses Iran in there, and of course Iran. You've got Iran has recently had its own presidential elections. You've got a new leader there. He is considered to be one of the hardliners, in fact, one of the hardest liners that they have in the country. I was listening earlier today to a reporter who covers the Iran for some of the newspapers, and she said, they had an election, but it's not really considered a fair election because the Supreme Council there determines who is allowed to run, and so they nixed a bunch of candidates who might have been a threat or a challenge to the current prevailing view there, and only allowed a handful of people moving forward. And among that handful, this was one of the most hardline people that they had. He's come in. He says he doesn't want to have anything to do with the negotiations with the U.S. right now. That may be a good thing. He doesn't want to talk to President Biden. That may be a good thing ultimately, if it sort of squelches the notion that we're going to move forward with trying to re-engage Iran into the agreement that President Obama had arranged with them. So we'll see what happens there, but Iran is a major threat. Russia is engaged with Iran. Joel has a chapter on the Russian outreach to Iran there because there are a few groups that are more different ideologically than Russia and Iran, and yet Russia sees Iran as a potential ally in creating and fomenting unrest in the Middle East and other places. And Iran sees Russia as an ally. Russia has some money that it can use towards that. Iran here, just a week or two ago, was sending ships over to Venezuela. That's a problem. Iran wants to be able to start selling oil again. It really can't because our sanctions right now are really clamped down on the economy there in Iran. It is a hurting economy. They find ways to sell their oil on the black market in various ways, but they do get some money there. But Iran is the issue. Then on the other hand, you've got the United Arab Emirates, you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got Egypt, and those are some of the strongest economically, financially, and politically, and they're wanting to become they're wanting to set some of the tensions aside and move forward in a peaceful relationship. So that is a major aspect that's happening there. And I'm not convinced that the Biden administration will continue. Joel said that it looks like they may go forward with the, or at least not keep the Abraham Accords. But I'm not sure if you're going to be paying much attention to the Palestinians. You're probably going to have trouble continuing and moving forward with the Abraham Accords. And one question I didn't ask Joel, which I was wanting to, but we just ran out of time, is whether or not the Abraham Accords die of neglect. If you're Saudi Arabia and you've got the Biden administration and they're focusing again on the Palestinians, do you continue to embrace the Abraham Accords or do you just simply let them go? If you're Jordan, do you do that? So we just don't know. And, of course, the change that's happened in Israel, we've got another Naftali Bennett, the new prime minister, is considered even more conservative, more hard right than Benjamin Netanyahu. As Joel said, he was considered a protege. The reason he is prime minister is he worked with a number of the other groups there in the Knesset to be able to get him elected as prime minister. The only real agreement they had was that it was time for Benjamin Netanyahu to go. There's several reasons for that, and one is the concern that Benjamin Netanyahu had just been in too long, and it was time to change. I'm not unsympathetic for that. One of the things I think George Washington did, one of his greatest legacies he left for the country was he served 2 terms and said, I'm out, I'm done. That 2-term limit, which was not a law, but was simply a limit that he set, became a pattern for everyone up to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who went for 4 terms. And after that, we created a new constitutional amendment to limit the president to 2 terms. So leaders don't get to rule forever in democracies. And so I think it was probably time for Benjamin Netanyahu to step down. However, the concern was, and I had been told this by people at the Jerusalem Post, that one of the reasons he wanted to stay in, there are several reasons, but one reason is that he would be prosecuted for certain crimes he's alleged to have committed. Don't know if he had committed those, but it certainly looks like some of those allegations and cases are going to be moving forward now that he's out. And it may be that Benjamin Netanyahu is able to change things around fairly quickly and get them back and become prime minister again sometime fairly soon, but we just don't know that. So we've got a Middle East that is in turmoil, and Joel Rosenberg is writing about that. He is ultimately hopeful for the Middle East long term, but that's because of Jesus coming back and changing things. He's not hopeful for them short term, even though he thinks there may be some beneficial things going on right now. So I'd encourage you to get a look at Joel's book when it comes out, and also to go to All Israeli News and All Arab News. I went and looked at those again last night. They're very good, and just providing sort of a summary of what's happening in those countries. And you need to know what's happening in those countries. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. We've covered a number of topics, both with Debbie Wuthnow on the iVoterGuide. We have information about that on pointofview.net. And also Dr. George Barna, who's just been a treasure for this country in his tracking the cultural changes that have been going on in the U.S. for decades, and it's not necessarily good. He's seeing in his latest paper, which we have on pointofview.net, the change in religious belief as more and more people who have identified as Christians are beginning to move away from that, especially the millennials, and that raises questions for the country and for our elections in the future. So he's with Arizona Christian University. I'd encourage you to look at that. If you're a young person thinking about it, I want to go to college here sometime soon, that may be a good place for you. And then, of course, Joel Rosenberg. We have all of that information available. I would also encourage you, if you are of the mind, to look at pointofview.net. There's a donate button there. You may want to feel like this is important for you. You get information that you don't get other places. I can assure you that's the case. And go to pointofview.net and make a donation to the organization. It is a nonprofit organization, and it depends upon donors who are willing to provide the funds for you. I want to thank for those who are able to help us with the manning the controls in there. And look forward to coming back. I think Kirby is at the National Religious Broadcasters. I believe he's going to be back later this week. But stay with us. We'll have more information for you tomorrow on Point of View.
You can make a difference. Yes, we face big tech censorship, government overreach, biblical illiteracy, and many other ills. And while there's no single action to overcome them, no real-life Captain America to come to our rescue, it's a fact that everyday Americans, like you, are the key to turning things around. The biggest thing you have is that you care, and all you need is the encouragement and the will to stand up for what's right. Your gift of Point of View enables us to reach more people with the information and free resources they need to join you in making a real difference in our homes, at work, in our churches, and our communities. Some of our friends have put $55,000 on the table as a matching challenge. You give, they will match it. Make a difference today by visiting pointofview.net/difference or call 1-800-347-5151. Double your impact today. Make a difference by taking this first step. Pointofview.net/difference. and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.